The great late Dr. Seuss quote, "Don't cry because it's over, smile because it happened." This video is dedicated to my father who passed away this very day in 1981, 41 long years ago. When he first passed, I kept wishing that I could still somehow talk or in any way speak to him, to ask him more questions, and in life, he always had an answer. Then as the years started to mount in the unstoppable patches of the Father Time, I wanted to keep in direct contact with my father, not just to ask questions, but to just merely communicate with him about anything that was on his mind. Anything, or nothing. Just any contact between father and son. His father, my grandfather, was a legal immigrant from Italy who was born, we believe, in 1877. His family's, quote, immigration lottery number came up in 1888 after 30 years of my great-grandfather's family waiting, and the then princely sum of $885 US payable to the United States Treasury. Using today's inflation calculator, this $885 US in 1888 is worth $27,609 US in today's money, 2021, or 2022 really. My father's father, my grandfather named Natali, he was 40 years old when my father was born in 1917. Ironically, my father was 4 years old when I was born in 1957. My father was child number 7 of 8 of the children that survived. There was at least 2 infant deaths in the era of time of cholera and Spanish flu, but as my parents did not relay that information specifically, it's hard to know what happened. My grandfather died of the Spanish flu in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in early 1918. My father also caught the same Spanish flu. He was almost 1 year old and was not expected to survive. They kept my grandfather's casket open a few extra days so they could bury my father with my grandfather Natali, but my father miraculously recovered, and the health department ordered my grandfather to be properly buried. His widow, which is my grandmother, was expecting with child number 8, my Aunt Annie. Then my grandmother died when my father was 7 years old. The children numbers 3 through 8 were all put in an orphanage from Hades, and could have been a Stephen King horror novel. Siblings number 1 and 2 were my uncles Gregory and Frank, respectively. Gregory was the oldest, and he was in the U.S. Navy and progressed to the rank of senior captain in his storied military Navy career. Not sure about Uncle Frank, only met him a handful of times. Never met Uncle Herman, or as Attilio as they called him in Italian, but did meet his family at Uncle Gregory's funeral in the early 1970s. We were not allowed to ask from any of us in any reasonable fashion, or any fashion at all, why Uncle Herman did not pay his last respects to the oldest brother. All that we knew that was that both Uncle Gregory and Frank were not able to get their other 6 siblings out of that orphanage from Hades. My father ran away from that orphanage when he was 15 years old, and that year would be 1932, in the clutches of the Great Depression, with no end in sight. He survived off the old boxcars on trains and railroad tracks. One night, as the handed-down story goes, the railroad police, were chasing the young men to capture and then get them into the army for bounties as bonuses. My father was one of the 2 that could outrun the railroad police, and the other man was a 19-year-old who was kicked out from the Navy for whatever. They both jumped the next train, not knowing where that train was going. Lo and behold, that train stopped in Baltimore, Maryland, right across the street from the MEBA Union Hall. That Union Hall was called the Marine Engineers Beneficial Association, and my father became a lifelong member of that. The 19-year-old convinced my father to lie about his age to get work, as the lowest deckhand sweeping steel mill shavings of 40 cents per hour. The then newly established minimum wage was 25 cents per hour, so my father was highly motivated to get a shot at freedom. Stop being on the run with no money during the horrific grasp of that Great Depression. Never having to go back to the orphanage. My father got that job for 1 day sweeping toxic steel shavings mixed with asbestos, and they did not even pay him for that 1 day. What was he going to do? He was a 15-year-old minor runaway. He was going to go to the police and report this? And he even faced deportation as an Italian-American, despite being first-generation Italian-American born in this country. The 19-year-old somehow talked his way onto an 8-month commission, and then he put his distance between him and my father. My father hid in the utility closet and hoped to see this 19-year-old friend to ask him for a few cents to survive some more. He waited and waited, but he fell asleep, and then it was nighttime. By then, this merchant marine vessel was at sea. With not much of a choice, my father sought out the captain of that vessel, intent on getting his 1 day's pay, if nothing else. And when were they going to land back on land again so he could go back to the orphanage or do whatever? That captain happened to be a fellow paisano, a fellow Italian. So I think that captain, he felt sorry for my father, and he hired my father as a general deckhand and promised him 25 cents per hour for the first month, then 10 cents more per hour each month afterwards. And I am sure my father was a demon-like worker because I saw him like that when he was in his 50s, mid to late 50s, still working 2 jobs at that advanced age. My father's work ethic was truly second to none. He wound up sailing the seas for 45 years until his health started breaking down in 1977. Yes, he was gone 50% of the time when we were children, but I still had that father. When he was, quote, stateside, he was still a full-time father in our eyes. The other kids we grew up with in our neighborhood and in school, they made fun of our situation, calling my father the part-time father. He's only around half the time. Of course, we defended his honor at every chance. And if my mother ever said, quote, wait until your father comes home, whatever we were doing, we knew we had to stop it at once. When that door handle opened at 6 p.m., if our mother told on us, we got punished. No questions asked, and it was usually severe. My father had the final say on all things in our household. If my mother gave us a break, we knew that as well. Yes, this is a political channel, so let me add this here. My father, as well as my mother, they were avid, rabid, flaming Democrats. Lifelong and inconceivable that they would ever vote any other way. They would never even think about giving a Republican a chance, no matter how bad the situation was. The very first black and white photo of any newspaper he ever saw was a photo of the, quote, Hoovervilles, showing the plight of regular Americans living in the Great Depression-induced squalor. He was a 15-year-old runaway with limited education, and the orphanage kept pulling him, my Uncle Herman, to work the gardens and fields at any whim, and their lack of proper education hurt both of them. My father grew up hating the then President Herbert Hoover and forever blamed Hoover for the Great Depression, as a lot of other Americans did. And Herbert Hoover was a Republican, thus all Republicans were evil and no good. My Uncle Gregory, the Navy captain, would try to reason with my father and explain things, but my father was stubborn and would never relent any talking points no matter what. Would never concede no matter if he was dead wrong. He wouldn't concede. How do I know all of this, and let alone remember any of this stuff? I'm the oldest of 4 children under my parents. It was me, then my 2 sisters, then my youngest brother. All of us were born within a year and a half of each other. When I was a small child, probably either 7 or 8 years old, I asked my father if I could sit by the adult men's table or gatherings in the living room, and my father balked, quote, children should be seen and not heard, was his reply. But my Uncle Gregory asked if there could be a tryout of sorts, and my father and my Uncle Frank relented and said, okay, 1 test trial. There was to be no talking from me, no questions, no getting out of line. Listen until you get bored and then go play with the other kids. This went on for about 12 years, and I never played with the other kids. I never got bored, I never asked any questions, and I never got out of line in any way in all those years. That was my first political education in American politics. Hearing what the working men of America thought about this great country. Tax-paying, patriotic Americans that loved their country and appreciated what America had to offer. They were all first-born generation Italian Americans and proud of it. Out of both my parents' extended family members, my father's 7 other siblings, my mother's 7 surviving siblings, my 35 cousins on my father's side, the 18 cousins on my mother's side, my 55 second cousins that I knew about on my father's side, and the 42 second cousins I knew on my mother's side, countless in-laws and live-ins, and other family hanging-ons, best friends, relatives, charity cases. Only the Navy captain, Uncle Gregory, was a Republican, and it was he and I. All the other people I just mentioned, they were all rabid, avid Democrats. That's fine. This is not a criticism of them. I'm just giving you a brief history of my father. I was a 7-year-old second grader when the late, great John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, was assassinated November 22nd, 1963. The school was closed early. School staffers and the vice principal and principal and teachers, they phoned every mother to get their children to school to be closed for a few days after such a tragic and horrific event. My mother cried like never before. We'd never seen her cry like that, and she was a huge JFK fan. It rained all day and all night, very hard that entire day in Baltimore, Maryland, and Baltimore County. And we were hit from behind by a drunk driver that same day when taking me and Terry up from school. It was a hard fender bender, but thank God no one really got seriously hurt. And then my father had to get out of the car. I remember having to deal with that as well as with this drunk, as well as upset wife and crying wife and mother of their 2 school children with the 2 infants in tow. Everyone over the age of 5 years old remembers where they were at during that unspeakable event in Dallas, Texas, the JFK assassination. You can't forget. I also recall my Democrat parents not liking LBJ too much. Instincts, maybe? My mother loved and adored and admired Jackie Kennedy. In her opinion, for the rest of her life, the best First Lady to ever walk the White House entrance. So I'm going to close this video with 2 quick stories. Okay, the first one. My father visited as a merchant marine every country with a seaport, at least once. Some 2 or 3 times. 2-month tour, 4-month tour, 6-month tour, and every now and then an 8th-month tour. He got stuck in Russia with the wheat tour in 1968 when the United States, when Richard Nixon gave Russia all this wheat for, there's had a famine. And what does Russia do? They turn around and they sell it to Italy for a profit. And that was my civics lessons in the Baltimore City schools, and they were good back then. Okay. Everywhere my father went, he heard this quip from those host countries. Okay. Quote, you and his American and your American friends on this ship are the 3 O's. Overpaid, oversexed, and over here. Yankee, get the fudge out of and go home. And that's not the exact language that my father relayed to that story. My high school buddies would then ask my father about Canada as their older brothers fled to Canada to evade the draft. And my father, he would get angry, and then he didn't care about your feelings. I mean, he was blunt and to the point. A man of very few words, but when he spoke, you listened. My father said even Halifax, Nova Scotia, is supposed to be the 51st state and our greatest ally, and our biggest trading partner, supposedly, when he was treated harshly by the Canadians and wore undercover clothing and busted up this American hippie bar named, quote, the New Yorker, that was funded by one of the draft dodgers' mothers, rich mothers, and not one RCMP was ever charged. 18 were tried, and 18 did not spend 1 minute in any Canadian jail. That's called ethno-nationalism. They weren't going to lock up their fellow Canadians for doing that to these draft dodgers, long-haired hippie draft dodgers, pot-smoking, beer-drinking draft dodgers. And I will be doing an entire series based on ethno-nationalism, so stay tuned for this channel. The second story and closing story. Sometime when I was about 15 years old, either my mother or my father clipped at the section of the Baltimore News America newspaper that we always got. You could tell by it, it was where the old Ann Landers section would be. And young teenage boys, we used to make fun of Ann Landers and Dear Abby. We'd go to school, we'd mock it and laugh at it and tease the girls with it. This poem took the place of the Ann Landers one day. I guess she didn't meet the deadline. Who knows what happened? But either my mother or my father, one of the two of them, clipped this out and put it in one of my Iron Man comic books. And that clip was titled, quote, The Man in the Glass. I did not ask which parent did this at the time, and at that time I did not care who did this, but I'm curious of which one did it now. But I did take the time to read this clip. So I'm going to close this video dedicated to my father on this very day, June 26, 2022. Dedicate this to my father by reading that poem right now. The Man in the Glass, poem by Peter Dale Wimbrow Sr. When you get what you want in your struggle for self, and the world makes you king for a day, just go to the mirror and ask yourself, and see what that man has to say. For it isn't your father or your mother or your wife whose judgment upon you must pass. The fellow whose verdict counts most in your life is the one staring back from the glass. He's the fellow to please, never mind all the rest, for he's with you, clear to the end. And if you pass your most difficult, dangerous test, if the man in the glass is your friend, you may fool the whole world down the pathway of years and get pats on the back as you pass, but your final reward will be the heartache and tears if you cheated the man in the glass. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Have a good day.